767 out of
This nation stands with the good people of New York City.
On my orders, the United States military has begun strikes.
We've been at war for 18 years now. We're not winning, we're not losing. Presidents come and go, but nothing really seems to change.
Vital national interest to send an additional 30,000 U.S. troops to Afghanistan.
Our troops will fight to win. We will fight to win.
So how are we going to tell this story? And we thought through these documents, these firsthand interviews from people who were involved, and yet this material had been suppressed for so long, that this was an original way to tell the story of all the failures in Afghanistan.
We're basically fighting the wrong way.
We just let the Afghans rip us off
because we didn't know how the story was going to end.
We are not really here to win.
In the fall of 2016, General Michael Flynn, who at that time was a retired U.S. general and intelligence director at the Pentagon, was working with Donald Trump on his campaign, and he was in the headlines quite a bit.
Love it. America first. America first.
And we'd heard there had been an interview done, a long interview done with Michael Flynn about the war in Afghanistan, and that this interview had been conducted by an obscure government agency called the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction. Since Flynn was in the news lot, we wanted to take a look at that interview, and so then we had to file a Freedom of Information Act request, and this dragged on for weeks, and Trump won the election, and Trump was president. Now Flynn was his national security advisor in the White House.
Good afternoon, everyone.
And ultimately, they denied us the interview. They said it wasn't a public record, so the Post had to file a lawsuit in federal court to obtain it.
Ambassadors, local, down at the local level, everybody did a great job. We're all doing a great job. Really? So if we're doing such a great job, why does it feel like we're losing?
Michael Flynn was, just unsparing in his criticism of how the war was going. Then we found out that Flynn was only one of hundreds of people who had been interviewed by this Inspector General for Afghanistan over the previous few years. So we thought, well, we want to see what everybody else had to say about the war, all these insiders and generals and diplomats. And the agency hemmed and hawed, and we won the lawsuit with Flynn, so they couldn't really say no. And it led to what ultimately was 3 years of legal battles, and we had to file a second lawsuit. We didn't start getting more of them really till 2018. There were hundreds of these. This is what we were told, over 400 of these interviews. And the more we got, the more we realized that the patterns here of what all these people said really added up to a real indictment of how the war was fought and the policies behind it and how misguided they were. Separately, as a batch of documents, we managed to obtain hundreds of memos that Donald Rumsfeld wrote when he was the defense secretary in the Pentagon. It was the National Security Archive at George Washington University that originally obtained them. So the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, it's a mouthful. They go by the acronym SIGAR, S-I-G-A-R. They were created by Congress in 2008 to investigate fraud and abuse in the war zone. These documents that we obtained were really for a special side project that they called Lessons Learned, that they wanted to depart from their usual mission, and they wanted to take a look at the policy failures behind the war. This started in 2014, they decided to do this, and the purpose at that point was they thought the war was winding down.
And by the end of next year, our war in Afghanistan will be over.
It's all ready for record.
University, and I had did a lot for years in Afghanistan, so I was quite well known.
If you're going to use a quote from me, could you run it by me?
But little did they know, the war was going to keep dragging on. In a way, these interviews are incredibly timely. There are people looking back at what went wrong, but they're still talking to the problems that exist now that still haven't been resolved, and why the war is still going on, and why the United States can't get out of it. Well, I told my editors, I said, these documents are something that first haven't seen the light of day. They were supposed to be using these interviews to publish their own report. So Cigars, starting in 2017, started publishing some reports every once in a while, but there were these big, thick, doorstop government reports with a lot of charts and numbers, and only a few quotes from the interviews they did.
Now, the goal of today's report is to help U.S., Afghan, and other coalition policymakers and agencies as they prepare for that daunting task of assisting with the reintegration of
the Inspector General himself, a guy named John Sopko. At one point I went to meet with him to tell him why I thought this information should be public, and we've already filed Freedom of Information Act requests. What's the problem? This is noteworthy, this is newsworthy, the public should know about this. And he agreed. Even this guy who's the head of this agency who's resisting giving us the documents, he says that the documents show the American people were lied to. We first came to your office 3 years ago, more than 3 years ago, in August of 2016, to ask for General Flynn's interview, which I haven't seen quoted in any of your lessons learned report, but it's an eyebrow-raising interview where he's very blunt about problems in the war. Why couldn't you be more forthcoming with these documents? Why did it take so long to release them?
Well, first of all, we don't have classifying authority.
Right.
So we have to send it back to, under FOIA, send it back to the agencies to review. And as a matter of fact, some of the material that I think may be at a Flynn interview, but I know some of the interviews, was classified.
Of the 400 interviews that were released, only about 15, 16 of them had any classified information redacted.
Yeah, but we still have to review the information. We also have to then go through a whole process on it.
But you weren't trying to slow roll it?
No. And no one's asked us to slow roll it, and we wouldn't slow roll it. I think of any Inspector General, I've probably been the most forthcoming on information. We're firm believers in openness and transparency, but we got to follow the law.
There's a clear pattern that what was said in private in these interviews contrasted so greatly with what U.S. officials, presidents, members of Congress, military commanders, what they had been saying in public over 18 years. Usually the talking points were all pretty similar. They would say the war's it's a tough place.
Conditions that are very trying.
It was a tough year.
Afghanistan, there's still fighting going on.
Increase in Taliban violence.
A higher level of violence.
But we're making progress.
Progress.
Significant progress.
You know, we're going in the right direction.
We are on the right road.
In the right direction.
And our strategy is sound.
I think it's important to understand that we do have a strategy that's quite broad.
That our strategy is succeeding.
And they would give a very detailed case for why the American people should keep having to fight this war halfway around the world. But when you read these interviews, people would say that this was a lot of spin and lies to some extent.
And after 03-04, once we're fully engaged in both wars, I can't remember us ever saying, should we be there? Are we being useful? Are we succeeding?
There were people in the White House who were giving interviews saying very explicitly that statistics or figures about the war that were indicators of who was winning and losing or how things were going were being twisted around or manipulated or almost made up.
As intelligence makes its way up higher, it gets consolidated and it gets really, really watered down.
One of the most sobering things to read for me was just how many people involved in the war were very blunt and candid that the strategy, the war strategy under Obama and Bush and Trump, they all said it was worthless. A few excerpts that I was shocked at. I mean, there was Doug Lute, General Lute, who was the Afghan war czar in the White House for 2 administrations, Bush and Obama. So this guy was, from the White House perspective, overseeing the war. And he's saying things like, we had no idea what we were doing. He said, I bumped into an even more fundamental lack of knowledge. We were devoid of a fundamental understanding of Afghanistan. General Dan McNeill, who was a 2-time military commander there. I tried to get someone to define for me what winning meant even before I went over, and nobody could. This is the commanding officer 2 times of the military in Afghanistan. To me, it's pretty astounding. These are the people in charge of the war, essentially saying it was a disaster, and they knew it. But I don't see any of these comments in your lessons learned reports. Why didn't you include those?
And that is sort of the limitation of where we go. See, as an inspector general, I don't do policy. What all you quoted were people talking about a bad policy. So,
why did your staff interview all these people I just quoted if they aren't going to be used?
They may well be used.
But they weren't. None of those people.
Not up to now, but.
That's the whole fundamental reason questioning why the United States is there. How could you let that drop?
Well, we didn't let it drop. I mean, the stuff is available. We're still producing these reports.
We just sued you twice to get our hands on it.
I don't know if quoting General Lutz saying that we screwed up or we didn't have the plan would be any more useful than the audits and investigations and other reports that we have, which make the same point.
You don't think that would be more useful to have the White House war czar, who admitted they had no idea what we were doing in Afghanistan, and you don't think that'd be useful to tell that to the public?
In my humble opinion, no.
When you talk about the very basics of why we were there and what they were trying to accomplish, these people who were in charge of the war, military commanders, ambassadors, people at the White House, they were very plain and blunt spoken about this, to say, we didn't have a strategy. We didn't even know who the enemy was. Who were we there to fight?
These carefully targeted actions are designed to disrupt the use of Afghanistan as a terrorist base of operations.
Well, originally, President Bush decided to start bombing Afghanistan because Osama bin Laden, he was in Afghanistan. So it seemed straightforward at the time. Well, we have to go to Afghanistan because we have to retaliate against al-Qaeda. But in pretty short order, within several months, there weren't many al-Qaeda left in Afghanistan. So then the war shifted, and then it became blurrier. Who were we fighting? Who was the enemy? Was it just al-Qaeda? Was it the Taliban? Well, yeah, we were fighting the Taliban, but we didn't even have a good sense of who the Taliban were or why we were fighting them. Some of these interviews are really eye-opening from people who played a really key role, and one of them was Ambassador Ryan Crocker, who actually served as the top U.S. diplomat in Afghanistan twice, and he was also well known as U.S. ambassador to Pakistan and Iraq. So this is a very seasoned diplomat. And he told a story to these interviewers. They were asking him about an Afghan vice president and defense minister named Mohammed Fahim Khan. Ambassador Crocker told this story about how when he first met Fahim Khan, this warlord, it was in 2002.
He was giggling, and he proceeded to relate to us that a mob had gotten out of control at the airport and had murdered the Minister of Civil Aviation. And he giggled while he related this. Much later, it emerged, I don't know if it was ever verified or not, it emerged that Fahim Khan himself had the minister killed. But I certainly came out of those opening months with the feeling that even by Afghan standards, I was in the presence of a totally evil person.
The good thing about Fahim Khan is that he is dead.
Yeah, and I check about every other day, and as far as I know, he's still dead.
This was one of our closest allies in Afghanistan for most of the war. The U.S. knew it was dealing with some very, very difficult, ruthless, brutal people, but the point Crocker was making is these were our allies in the war. We had some difficult decisions to make on who we were fighting against and who we were fighting with. It makes you realize that this war is in real trouble if you can't figure out who the enemy is, why we're fighting them, and what we hope to accomplish. Now, what they've done is they've blacked out the names of probably 90% of the people they've interviewed. They also redacted some material that they said was classified. They redacted a lot of material that they just said the public has no right to know. Now, you mentioned about there's some people whose names you couldn't divulge.
Yeah.
And your staff has made the argument that they're whistleblowers. Do you see these people, these 400-some people, as whistleblowers?
When somebody comes to you with information that could be derogatory to their current job, their former job, their colleagues, we treat that information carefully.
But they didn't come to you, you went to them.
Well, we went to them, whatever. Just like a Washington Post reporter will go to somebody and somebody will say, I'll talk to you, but I don't want the information revealed.
But you're not a Washington Post reporter,
Well,
you're an inspector general,
but
right?
I'm under the same restrictions about not divulging sensitive information. You may have a different objective. You want to have the name out there, you can talk to them, and that's okay. That's your job. But my job and my people's job was to try to get the information, to try to come up with best practices, with lessons learned. And if the person said, I'm not going to talk to you if you quote me, well, okay, we'll take the information anyway, because this is a different type of report than our normal.
The Post really believes very strongly that the public has a right to know who said these things about Afghanistan. That if these people are saying that the Afghan war was screwed up, that the United States didn't know what it was doing in Afghanistan, that this is a waste of money, a waste of lives that has gone on for 18 years, those are very damning comments from people who are involved in the war. And the public has a right to know who's saying these things. And they went to great lengths to hide this material from the public.
There's lack of courage.
The administration simply wasn't being held to account for what was going on in Afghanistan. There was very little high-level Congress wasn't attention. Criticizing
but we just did so many things that weren't thought out systematically that ultimately doomed our mission in Afghanistan.